On December 8, 1941, just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck Clark Field and other U.S. air bases in Luzon. The U.S. Far East Air Force, caught by surprise, lost most of its planes on the ground. The destruction of air power gave Japan total control of the skies over the Philippines. Within days, Japanese ground forces landed at several points across Luzon, including Lingayen Gulf in the north and Lamon Bay in the south. The defense of the Philippines was led by General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East. His forces consisted of about 31,000 U.S. troops and over 100,000 Filipino soldiers from the newly established Philippine Army. Many of the Filipino troops were poorly trained and lacked modern weapons. The combined force, though large in number, was short on artillery, ammunition, and air support. Japanese troops advanced rapidly through Luzon. The U.S. and Filipino defenders tried to hold positions near the beaches, but were pushed back by the superior Japanese firepower and mobility. Recognizing that a defense of the entire island was impossible, MacArthur implemented War Plan Orange 3, a pre-war strategy calling for a withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula. The peninsula's rugged terrain and limited road access made it suitable for a defensive stand. The plan also relied on supplies stockpiled in the area and the assumption that the U.S. Pacific Fleet would send reinforcements within 6 months. By early January 1942, American and Filipino troops had retreated into Bataan. Around 80,000 troops and 26,000 civilians crowded into the narrow peninsula. Japanese forces pursued closely, cutting off routes to Manila. On January 2nd, Japanese troops entered Manila, which had been declared an open city to avoid its destruction. The U.S. command transferred headquarters to the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay. The defense of Bataan began in earnest. The terrain favored the defenders. Dense jungle, rivers, and hills created natural barriers. The Japanese underestimated the resistance they would face. They expected to capture Bataan within weeks. Instead, the defenders organized a strong line and used the difficult terrain to their advantage. Fierce fighting erupted along the Abucay-Mauban line in January 1942. Despite shortages of food and ammunition, American and Filipino forces inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese. Disease soon became a greater threat than combat. The defenders were isolated and lacked resupply. Japanese air and naval superiority made it impossible for the Allies to deliver food or medical supplies. Rations were reduced repeatedly, from 2 meals a day to 1 small serving of rice and soup. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever spread rapidly through the ranks. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medicine ran out. Soldiers weakened by starvation and disease struggled to remain in fighting condition. By February, the situation was desperate. The Japanese had reinforced their troops on Bataan with fresh divisions. Hama reorganized his forces and launched renewed assaults. On February 22nd, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and move to Australia to coordinate Allied operations in the Pacific. Before departing on March 11th, MacArthur issued his famous statement, "I shall return." Command of the remaining forces passed to Major General Jonathan M. Wainwright and Major General Edward P. King, Jr., who commanded the forces directly on Bataan. The defenders continued to fight under worsening conditions. Ammunition stocks were nearly gone. Horses and pack animals were slaughtered for food. Medical units lacked even basic antiseptics. Japanese artillery pounded defensive positions daily, and constant air raids wore down morale. By early April, organized resistance could no longer be maintained. Troops were collapsing from hunger and disease at the front lines. On April 3, 1942, General Hama launched his final offensive against the Bataan defenses. Japanese artillery, supported by aircraft from Formosa, bombarded Allied positions for several days. The exhausted defenders could not hold. The line broke near Mount Samat on April 6th, and Japanese forces pushed rapidly south. Units that tried to resist were surrounded or destroyed. Communications collapsed, and command coordination became impossible. By April 8th, General King concluded that further resistance would only lead to pointless loss of life. He realized that no relief force was coming, and the men were physically incapable of continuing combat. Without authorization from higher command, King decided to surrender the forces on Bataan to prevent complete annihilation. He sent officers under a white flag to negotiate with the Japanese. On April 9, 1942, the surrender of the Bataan Defense Force became official. Approximately 76,000 soldiers, around 12,000 Americans, and 64,000 Filipinos laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of American forces in history. Many soldiers destroyed their weapons before surrendering to prevent them from being used by the enemy. They expected to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. However, the Japanese army had no preparation or logistical plan to handle such a large number of captives. The 14th Army had expected only a few thousand prisoners. Instead, it faced the sudden responsibility of controlling and transporting over 75,000 weakened, starving men across difficult terrain with little transportation available. Japanese supply lines were already stretched, and water sources along the roads were scarce. Japanese officers and soldiers viewed surrender as dishonorable. In Japanese military culture, rooted in the Bushido Code, a soldier was expected to fight to the death rather than be captured. This belief shaped their treatment of Allied prisoners. The Japanese considered those who surrendered as having forfeited honor and rights. As a result, the captured men were treated with contempt and cruelty from the moment of surrender. After the capitulation, prisoners were assembled at Mariveles and Bagak, the southern points of the Bataan Peninsula. They were stripped of valuables, searched, and forced to sit for hours in the scorching sun. Japanese guards beat prisoners who could not stand or who attempted to speak. Many prisoners were already suffering from dehydration, malaria, or open wounds. There was no food distribution for the first day after surrender. The Japanese command decided to move the prisoners northward to San Fernando, Pampanga, a distance of about 65 miles. From there, they would be transported by rail to campus, and then marched again to the newly designated prison camp at Camp O'Donnell. The prisoners were divided into columns of several hundred men each, guarded by armed Japanese soldiers. The march began in the following days under extreme heat, with little food, water, or medical care. At this point, no one among the prisoners understood the full scale of what was about to happen. The Japanese regarded the transfer as a routine movement of prisoners, but the lack of planning, combined with hostility toward captives, turned it into one of the most brutal episodes of the war. The men had already endured months of starvation and combat, and now faced the ordeal of a forced march under lethal conditions. The Fall of Bataan marked a critical turning point in the Pacific War. With Bataan in Japanese hands, only the island fortress of Corregidor remained in American control in the Philippines. Japanese victory secured access to Manila Bay and cut off Allied lines of retreat. It demonstrated Japan's dominance in the early months of the war and the vulnerability of Allied forces in the Pacific. The surrender was a devastating blow to American and Filipino morale. For months, the defenders of Bataan had fought against overwhelming odds, delaying Japan's advance and buying time for Allied forces elsewhere. Their resistance had become a symbol of courage. but their capture revealed the harsh reality of Japan's rapid conquests. In the aftermath of the surrender, tens of thousands of weakened, diseased, and starving prisoners stood at the mercy of an occupying army, unprepared and unwilling to provide humane treatment. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in the history of World War II. The forced march from Bataan to prison camps that claimed thousands of lives and became known as the Bataan Death March. When the surrender of Bataan became official on April 9, 1942, the immediate challenge for the Japanese command was the movement of tens of thousands of prisoners from the southern tip of the peninsula to holding areas in the north. The 14th Army under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma had not planned for such a massive number of captives. The Army's supply system was already overextended from months of combat. Transportation, food, and water were insufficient even for Japanese troops, let alone prisoners. The result was a chaotic, improvised system that placed all burden on exhausted prisoners of war. After General Edward P. King Jr. formally surrendered the Bataan Defense Force, Japanese units began rounding up Allied troops across the peninsula. The process was uncoordinated and violent. Different Japanese regiments acted independently, using their own judgment in handling the captives. Prisoners were ordered to assemble at various points, primarily at Mariveles on the southern tip and at Bagak on the western side. Japanese soldiers patrolled the roads, shouting orders in Japanese and striking anyone who moved slowly or failed to understand commands. At Mariveles, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers gathered in the open under direct sunlight. Many had not eaten for several days and were dehydrated and weak. They were forced to sit or stand for hours without water. Some men fainted from exhaustion. Guards beat them with rifle butts to make them rise. Soldiers were stripped of watches, rings, and personal belongings. Those found carrying Japanese souvenirs or enemy currency were executed on the spot. The looting of prisoners' possessions became routine. From Mariveles, Japanese officers organized the prisoners into groups of approximately 100 to 500 men, guarded by a small number of soldiers. These groups were given no clear instructions or rest time. Once a column was formed, it was ordered to begin marching north toward Balanga and then onward to San Fernando. The Japanese used bayonets, rifle butts, and kicks to drive the columns forward. There were no vehicles or transport provided for the sick or wounded. Men who could not keep up were shot, bayoneted, or left to die by the roadside. Confusion marked the entire process. The Japanese command had issued general orders to move prisoners, but had not specified routes, schedules, or logistical support. Each unit interpreted the order differently. Some columns moved faster than others, creating congestion along the narrow roads. Prisoners often stumbled into other groups or were redirected by guards who did not know where to send them. The tropical heat was intense, reaching above 40 degrees Celsius during the day. The roads were dusty and unshaded, with little access to clean water. Executions began almost immediately. Japanese guards, frustrated by the slow pace of the march, used violence as a method of control. Anyone who stopped to rest, attempted to drink from roadside ditches, or fell behind was killed. Witnesses later testified that guards would sometimes force prisoners to stand in formation and shoot every 10th man as punishment for perceived disobedience. Prisoners were also executed for minor reasons, such as possessing Japanese equipment or attempting to help a fallen comrade. At several points along the route, Japanese trucks carrying their own wounded or supplies sped past the prisoner columns. Guards often forced prisoners off the road into ditches to make way for vehicles. Anyone too weak to move quickly enough was struck or killed. The pace of the march varied. Some groups covered only a few miles per day due to congestion and constant halts, while others were driven at nearly running speed for long stretches. The first major waypoint was Balanga, around 25 miles north of Mariveles. The journey to this point was marked by constant abuse. Prisoners who collapsed were often left where they fell. Bodies began to line the road, attracting flies and vultures. Japanese soldiers forbade burial, claiming it delayed progress. Filipino civilians who attempted to offer food or water to the prisoners were beaten or executed in front of them as a warning. Despite this, some civilians still managed to pass sugarcane, coconuts, or small amounts of water to the men when guards were not watching. Discipline among the Japanese guards deteriorated further as the march continued. Many of the guards were from combat units that had recently fought on Bataan and had suffered heavy casualties. They viewed the prisoners with hatred and contempt, blaming them for the loss of comrades. Others were inexperienced reservists from the 65th Brigade and lacked training in handling prisoners. Their actions reflected both frustration and a systemic failure in command responsibility. Medical care was non-existent. The prisoners included thousands of wounded and sick soldiers. Some had untreated gunshot wounds, malaria, or dysentery. There were no medical officers allowed to provide aid. Prisoners carrying stretchers or helping the wounded were threatened or killed if they slowed the pace. In many cases, the sick and injured were executed rather than transported. At night, the prisoners were herded into open fields or roadside clearings for rest. These temporary holding areas, called rest points by Japanese officers, had no shelter, food, or sanitation. Prisoners were given little to no water. Many were forced to sleep on bare ground surrounded by corpses of those who had died during the day. Guards often used these stops to commit acts of violence, including random beatings and executions. Prisoners caught attempting to escape were tied to trees and shot or bayoneted in front of others as examples. The march from Bagak, on the Western Road, followed a similar pattern. Prisoners from that side of the peninsula were also gathered and forced northward under the same brutal conditions. These two streams eventually merged near Pilar, before continuing towards San Fernando. The total distance varied by route, but averaged around 65 miles. For men already weakened by months of combat and starvation, even a short distance under such conditions was fatal. Eyewitness accounts later confirmed the chaotic nature of the early stages of the march. The prisoners had no food rations for several days. The only available water came from contaminated ditches, puddles, or animal troughs. Those who drank risked dysentery. Those who did not often collapsed from dehydration. The Japanese made no effort to provide water distribution. In some instances, they placed water containers near the road, but beat or shot prisoners who attempted to approach them. The brutality was not only physical, but psychological. Japanese soldiers mocked the prisoners, calling them cowards and weaklings. Captured officers were singled out for harsher treatment. Some were forced to witness executions of their men. Others were compelled to carry heavy loads as punishment. The guards demonstrated complete disregard for the laws of war. Corpses accumulated rapidly along the route. Prisoners described seeing bodies every few yards, men who had been bayoneted, shot, or simply dropped dead from exhaustion. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition. The smell of death spread across the roads of Bataan. Japanese officers did not allow burial parties, arguing it would delay the movement. In later stages, Filipino civilians quietly buried the dead along the roadside once the columns passed. The organization of the columns also broke down over time. Some groups became so reduced in number that they merged with others, while others disintegrated completely. Communication between the Japanese units escorting different groups was limited. Prisoners who lagged behind sometimes encountered new groups of guards unfamiliar with them, leading to further violence and confusion. The lack of clear Japanese leadership in managing the march became evident. The 14th Army Headquarters issued only general directives to move the prisoners north. Subordinate units received no written instructions about treatment, rest schedules, or supply distribution. As a result, individual soldiers and junior officers acted independently, leading to random killings and unregulated brutality. The absence of food supply lines meant that even the guards were often hungry, which further contributed to erratic behavior. By the time many of the columns reached the area around Balanga, the prisoners were in critical condition. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and blood. Many marched barefoot after their shoes disintegrated. Some men attempted to support each other, forming small groups to help the weakest. But the Japanese broke these up violently. Prisoners caught trying to carry others were sometimes executed. The forced pace continued regardless of casualties. Among the earliest documented massacres occurred near the town of Balanga, where a group of prisoners unable to continue was forced to sit in formation and then shot by a firing squad. Similar incidents took place at Lamao and Orani. In some locations, Japanese soldiers used bayonets to kill men too weak to stand. The killings were public and intended to instill fear in the survivors. Despite the brutality, there was minimal organization to collect or count the prisoners during these stages. No official records were kept of how many started or how many died along the road. Japanese units focused solely on moving the columns north as quickly as possible. The High Command in Manila received only fragmentary reports. The forced movement from Mariveles and Bagak to Balanga represented only the initial phase of what became known as the Bataan Death March. In these early days after surrender, chaos, lack of planning, and deliberate cruelty combined to create catastrophic conditions. Thousands of men perished before even reaching the halfway point to San Fernando. The march had begun as a logistical operation, but immediately turned into a lethal ordeal. The Japanese Army's inability to manage prisoners humanely and its cultural contempt for surrender created an environment where violence was unchecked. The combination of heat, hunger, and exhaustion ensured that only the strongest would survive the first days on the roads of Bataan. These initial stages established the deadly pattern that would continue throughout the entire journey. Forced marches under extreme conditions, random executions, denial of food and water, and the complete collapse of order. The survivors of these first days would face even greater suffering as the march extended north toward San Fernando, where the next phase of their captivity awaited. As the columns of prisoners advanced beyond Balanga and Orani, the conditions of the Bataan Death March worsened dramatically. The initial confusion and disorder turned into systematic brutality and neglect. The central phase of the march, stretching from mid-Bataan to San Fernando, claimed the largest number of lives. By this stage, many prisoners had been marching for several days without adequate food, water, or rest. The men were reduced to staggering lines of malnourished soldiers under constant threat of violence. Temperatures during mid-April 1942 on the plains of central Luzon reached over 40 degrees Celsius. The roads were open, dusty, and unshaded. Most prisoners wore the same uniforms they had fought in, torn, sweat-soaked, and infested with insects. The marchers were already weakened by malaria, dysentery, and hunger from months of siege in Bataan. Their physical condition deteriorated rapidly under these extreme conditions. Japanese guards enforced the pace with beatings, bayonets, and rifle butts. Prisoners were required to maintain a steady march regardless of terrain or physical condition. Anyone who stumbled or fell was immediately struck or killed. Witnesses later described that the road was constantly littered with corpses, some shot for slowing down, others collapsing from exhaustion. The Japanese did not allow any pauses to aid the fallen. Prisoners were forbidden to stop, even for a few seconds, to help their comrades. Water scarcity became the greatest immediate threat. Most of the route passed through dry, open countryside where wells were few. The Japanese provided no organized water distribution, and guards often denied requests for rest or hydration. When columns passed by wells, ponds, or roadside ditches, desperate men broke formation to drink. Many were shot or bayoneted for doing so. Survivors later recalled seeing prisoners executed for simply kneeling to scoop water with their hands. Some men drank from mud puddles or animal wallows, risking disease. Others resorted to drinking their own urine to survive. Food was nearly non-existent. The Japanese provided no rations for the first several days. A few prisoners managed to collect scraps of rice dropped from passing Japanese trucks, or sugar cane thrown by Filipino civilians who defied orders by helping the captives. In rare cases, guards allowed the men to buy food from locals, but this was inconsistent and often followed by looting or executions. Many prisoners went the entire march without a single proper meal. The beatings were constant. Japanese guards, frustrated by the slow progress, took out their anger on the prisoners. They struck men with rifle butts, bamboo poles, or metal rods. Guards used bayonets to prod prisoners in the back to keep them moving. When prisoners could no longer walk, they were often made to stand and were executed. The most common method was a bayonet thrust to the abdomen or chest. In other cases, prisoners were forced to kneel and were shot in the head. Groups of prisoners were sometimes made to perform humiliating acts as punishment. Some were ordered to stand in the sun for hours without moving. Others were forced to dig shallow holes, told to lie in them, and then shot. In several documented incidents, Japanese guards made prisoners bury the bodies of their comrades and then killed the burial detail afterward. Such acts reflected the breakdown of discipline and the dehumanization of prisoners in the eyes of their captors. The march from Orani to Lubao was particularly deadly. This section of road crossed open plains with no trees or shade. Prisoners walked through clouds of dust raised by their own feet and by passing Japanese vehicles. The heat caused men to collapse in large numbers. Those who fell behind were bayoneted without hesitation. The Japanese made no effort to count or recover the bodies. They were left where they fell, sometimes looted by guards or stripped of uniforms for trophies. As the columns approached Pampanga province, the number of surviving prisoners had sharply declined. Of the tens of thousands who had started from Mariveles and Bagak, large portions had already died along the way. In some groups, more than half the men were gone. The survivors moved almost automatically, driven by instinct rather than strength. Their feet were swollen and bleeding. Some soldiers wrapped them with scraps of cloth or leaves. The smell of decomposing bodies filled the air along much of the route. Eyewitness testimonies collected after the war provided detailed descriptions of the atrocities. Private Eugene Nielsen, an American survivor, recalled that guards took pleasure in killing the weak. If a man fell, they bayoneted him where he lay. Sometimes they decapitated men in front of us to keep us moving. Another survivor, Filipino officer Jose R. Lamas, testified that the Japanese considered us animals. They laughed as they killed the sick. It was not organized slaughter, but it was constant. Despite the brutality, isolated instances of mercy occurred. A few Japanese officers attempted to enforce order or prevent random killings, but their authority was limited. The majority of guards were enlisted men acting on their own judgment. Command oversight was minimal. The 14th Army headquarters did not issue explicit orders to mistreat prisoners, but it also did nothing to prevent it. The lack of coordination and the cultural contempt for surrender ensured that abuse became systemic. Japanese soldiers' rationale for their actions was influenced by indoctrination. The Imperial Japanese Army had long taught that surrender was a violation of honor. Captured soldiers were seen as less than human. Furthermore, the Japanese Army itself was under severe logistical strain. Guards were hungry, fatigued, and undersupplied. Many blamed the prisoners for delaying operations on Luzon. In this environment, cruelty became normalized and even encouraged through example. The march also became a means of revenge. Japanese troops had suffered heavy casualties in the final battles for Bataan. Some of them had lost friends and officers in the fighting. They viewed the surrendering Americans and Filipinos as responsible for the deaths of their comrades. Beating or killing prisoners was seen as retribution. Statements from captured Japanese soldiers after the war confirmed that revenge played a major role in their treatment of POWs. As the march neared the town of Lubao, Japanese trucks and tanks occasionally drove alongside the columns. Some guards used these vehicles to intimidate prisoners, running close to them or forcing them off the road. Prisoners too weak to move were sometimes crushed deliberately. At one point, survivors recalled seeing trucks drive over bodies to clear the path. Such incidents were not isolated. They reflected the total lack of restraint in the handling of captives. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery and heat stroke claimed thousands. The prisoners' weakened immune systems made them susceptible to infection from even minor wounds. Blood poisoning and gangrene became common. Some prisoners with severe injuries begged fellow soldiers to kill them to avoid being executed by guards. Others simply lay down and refused to move further, accepting death. Despite the horror, a few men managed to survive through quick thinking and cooperation. Prisoners learned to stay near the middle of the column, where guards were less attentive. Those in front or rear were at greater risk of being targeted. Some men formed small groups to share bits of food or water, keeping each other moving. Others pretended to be dead when struck, then crawled into ditches once the column moved on. Filipino civilians played a critical role in helping escapees. Some prisoners who slipped away into the jungle were hidden and later rescued by guerrilla forces. As the march continued into the Central Plains, the number of incidents of mass killing increased. Near Lubao, a group of about 350 prisoners who could not continue was executed by machine gun fire after being ordered to sit along the roadside. Similar events occurred in Guagua and Bacolor. Japanese guards sometimes used the executions as examples to motivate the remaining marchers to keep moving. By the time the columns approached San Fernando, the survivors were at the limits of endurance. Their physical condition was dire. Most were skeletal, covered in sores, and barely able to stand. The march had lasted about 6 to 10 days for most groups, depending on where they started and the pace forced upon them. The total distance of roughly 65 miles had turned into an ordeal of starvation and systematic killing. When prisoners finally reached San Fernando, they were herded into open pens or schoolyards surrounded by barbed wire. There they were counted roughly and given their first meager food in several days, often just a handful of rice. Water was still scarce and sanitation was non-existent. Many died shortly after arrival, collapsing from exhaustion or disease. For them, the march ended not in relief, but in death. Accurate figures on casualties during the march are difficult to determine due to the absence of records. Estimates from post-war investigations vary, but most agree that between 6,000 and 10,000 Filipino soldiers and 600 to 650 American soldiers died during the march itself. Thousands more would perish later in captivity. These numbers reflected not deliberate extermination by centralized order, but the cumulative effect of neglect, brutality, and the Japanese Army's contempt for prisoners of war. Survivor testimonies later became key evidence in war crimes trials. They revealed a consistent pattern of abuse across all prisoner columns. While the scale of atrocities varied by location and commander, the essential conditions remained the same everywhere: extreme heat, thirst, starvation, exhaustion, and constant violence. The Bataan Death March became a defining symbol of Japan's treatment of prisoners during World War II. In this central and deadliest phase of the march, thousands of men lost their lives to a combination of hunger, disease, and executions. The survivors who reached San Fernando did so with permanent physical and psychological scars. They had endured one of the most severe ordeals of captivity in modern military history. The march, which had begun as a forced movement of prisoners, had transformed into a deliberate process of attrition where only endurance and chance determined survival. The survivors of the Bataan Death March reached their final destination in early April 1942. The makeshift detention area at Camp O'Donnell, located near Capas in Tarlac Province, central Luzon. The Japanese had selected this former Philippine Army training camp to house the tens of thousands of prisoners captured after the fall of Bataan. The facility was never designed to accommodate such a massive influx of captives. Within days, over 60,000 Filipino soldiers and around 9,000 Americans were crowded into the compound, with no adequate food, water, medical care, or sanitation. Upon arrival, the prisoners were stripped of their possessions, and any remaining valuables, watches, rings, or personal items, were confiscated by the guards. The Japanese soldiers conducted searches to remove hidden rations or medicine, sometimes beating those caught with contraband. The condition of the men was already deteriorated from the march. Many had infected wounds, severe dehydration, or diseases such as dysentery and malaria. Camp O'Donnell quickly became a site of mass suffering and death. The camp infrastructure consisted mainly of dilapidated barracks built before the war. The Japanese made no immediate effort to improve the facilities or provide adequate shelter. The barracks were overcrowded, with hundreds of men packed into spaces designed for far fewer. Many were forced to sleep on the ground, exposed to heat, rain, and insects. The water supply was grossly insufficient. A single spigot served thousands, leading to long lines that stretched across the compound. Prisoners often fainted or collapsed while waiting. Contaminated runoff and human waste contributed to the spread of disease. The food provided was minimal and nutritionally poor. The standard ration consisted of a small portion of rice or camote, sweet potato, sometimes accompanied by watery soup made from spoiled vegetables. Starvation became severe. The caloric intake was far below what was necessary for survival, especially for men already weakened by weeks of marching. Some prisoners resorted to eating grass, weeds, or insects. American medical officers recorded instances of men dying simply because their bodies could no longer metabolize the meager food they received. Medical conditions inside Camp O'Donnell were catastrophic. The camp hospital, if it could be called that, consisted of open-air huts without medicine or supplies. There were no beds, no antiseptics, and no clean bandages. Filipino and American doctors, themselves prisoners, did what they could using improvised materials, sometimes using old uniforms as dressings or boiling water to sterilize crude instruments. Dysentery spread rapidly due to contaminated water, while malaria and beriberi took hold among the malnourished. Death rates rose daily. At one point, more than 400 prisoners were dying each day, most of them Filipinos. The Japanese guards showed little concern for the welfare of the captives. Requests for more food or medical assistance were ignored or punished. In some instances, guards beat prisoners for falling out of formation or failing to salute. Executions also occurred. Prisoners caught attempting to escape were shot or bayoneted in public view. Japanese command maintained strict discipline through intimidation. Conditions for the Filipino prisoners were even worse than for the Americans. The Japanese prioritized the Americans for transfer or supplies, leaving Filipino soldiers to suffer longer in the camp. As the situation worsened, Japanese command decided to separate the two groups. In late May 1942, approximately 4,000 surviving Americans were moved from Camp O'Donnell to a new location, Cabanatuan, a larger facility closer to Nueva Ecija. The Filipinos, numbering in the tens of thousands, were largely left behind. By the time the camp was finally turned over to the control of the puppet Philippine government in June 1942, an estimated 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans had died at Camp O'Donnell. Cabanatuan soon became the main holding site for American prisoners captured in Bataan and later in Corregidor. This new camp was divided into 3 sections: Cabanatuan number 1, number 2, and number 3, though most of the prisoners were concentrated in Camp number 1. Conditions there, while slightly improved from O'Donnell, remained harsh. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, with strict rules enforced by Japanese and Korean guards. Prisoners lived in bamboo huts with thatched roofs, sleeping on wooden platforms. Food at Cabanatuan was still inadequate, though water access was somewhat better than at O'Donnell. Daily rations consisted of rice and watery vegetable stew. Malnutrition persisted, and disease continued to claim lives. Prisoners who could no longer work were placed in a makeshift hospital area, where they lay on bamboo slats without bedding or medicine. The hospital death rate remained high due to malaria, dysentery, and vitamin deficiencies. Forced labor became a daily routine for the men at Cabanatuan. The Japanese used prisoners for maintenance, construction, and agricultural work. Some were assigned to gather wood or repair roads within and around the camp. Others were placed in external work details, known as outside parties, sent to different parts of Luzon to work on airfields, farms, or docks. These work details were dangerous, and men often faced beatings from guards or accidents due to exhaustion. Among the harshest assignments was the construction of airstrips for the Japanese military. Prisoners were forced to dig and level ground using only hand tools under the tropical sun with little water or rest. Those who collapsed were often beaten or left to die where they fell. The Japanese rationale for such treatment was rooted in their military code, which viewed surrender as dishonorable. In their eyes, captured soldiers were beneath consideration and not deserving of humane treatment. Despite the brutality, prisoners at Cabanatuan developed systems of mutual support. American officers attempted to maintain order, assigning tasks and keeping records. Medical personnel continued to improvise treatments. They used quinine or atabrine when available, and some managed to grow small vegetable gardens to supplement the poor diet. Filipino civilians living near the camp occasionally risked their lives to smuggle food or medicine through the fences, providing a lifeline for some of the inmates. The Japanese command at Cabanatuan also organized periodic transfers of prisoners to other destinations in the Philippines or abroad. As the war progressed, many American POWs were selected for transport to Japan, Formosa, or Manchuria to perform forced labor in mines, factories, and shipyards. These transfers, later called hell ships because of the inhuman conditions aboard, claimed many lives. But that is beyond the immediate scope of this chapter. By the end of 1942, Camp O'Donnell had been effectively closed as a POW facility, and Cabanatuan became the central site of imprisonment for the surviving Americans. Life in the camp settled into a grim routine. Roll calls were conducted twice daily. Punishments were severe for any infractions. The prisoners learned to hide their illnesses or weakness to avoid being selected for punishment or hard labor. Deaths, while fewer than at O'Donnell, continued steadily. Graves were dug daily outside the camp perimeter, marked with simple wooden crosses. Filipino resistance groups operating in central Luzon occasionally gathered intelligence from the area around the camps. Information about the prisoners' conditions eventually reached the outside world through escaped POWs. One of the most significant escapes occurred in 1943, when several Americans successfully fled Cabanatuan and made contact with guerrilla units. Their testimonies provided the first detailed accounts of the Bataan Death March and the conditions inside the camps, alerting Allied authorities to the scale of Japanese abuses. For those who remained imprisoned, survival depended on endurance, discipline, and chance. Some prisoners managed to barter small items or skills for extra food from sympathetic guards or civilian workers. Others succumbed to despair or illness. Letters from families were almost non-existent, and news of the war was tightly controlled. Rumors circulated about Allied advances in the Pacific, but confirmation was scarce. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Japanese administration continued to exploit POW labor for military purposes. At Cabanatuan, prisoners built warehouses, repaired roads, and maintained agricultural projects. The harsh climate and limited nutrition made this labor grueling. Medical staff documented cases of pellagra, scurvy, and blindness due to vitamin deficiency. Despite these conditions, the prisoners maintained a chain of command, preserving some sense of military order even under captivity. Discipline within the camp was rigidly enforced. The Japanese required strict formations for roll calls, and any perceived disobedience could result in public beatings or executions. The guards often acted unpredictably, enforcing minor infractions with violence. This instability contributed to constant psychological stress among the prisoners. By late 1944, the Japanese began preparing for the eventual threat of American invasion. Many prisoners were transferred out of the Philippines to prevent their liberation. Those remaining at Cabanatuan faced increasing shortages as supply lines broke down under Allied attacks. Food and medical supplies became scarcer, and death rates rose again. In total, of the approximately 75,000 soldiers captured after the Fall of Bataan, fewer than half would survive the years of imprisonment that followed. The march had been only the beginning of their ordeal. Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan became symbols of the continued suffering of Allied prisoners under Japanese control. These camps reflected the larger pattern of neglect and brutality that characterized Japan's treatment of POWs throughout the war. The survivors of these camps endured the consequences of starvation, disease, and forced labor long after the Bataan Death March ended. Their condition upon liberation in 1945 revealed the full scale of the atrocities committed in the Philippines during this period. The tragedy of Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan remains one of the darkest chapters in the Pacific War, marking the continuation of suffering that began on the roads of Bataan. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Allied powers faced the task of documenting, investigating, and prosecuting the extensive war crimes committed by Imperial Japan. Among the most notorious of these crimes was the Bataan Death March, a series of atrocities that resulted in the deaths of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners of war. The immediate post-war years became a period of legal reckoning, public testimony, and historical documentation that established the march as one of the defining examples of Japanese brutality in the Pacific War. Following Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, U.S. military authorities under General Douglas MacArthur initiated a comprehensive war crimes investigation in the Philippines. The U.S. Army's War Crimes Branch, operating from Manila, gathered testimonies from survivors of the Bataan Death March and the subsequent prison camps at Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan. Investigators collected medical records, burial lists, and statements detailing the abuse, starvation, and executions carried out by Japanese personnel. The evidence was used to build cases against officers of the Imperial Japanese Army responsible for the treatment of prisoners. The primary Japanese officer held accountable for the events of the Bataan campaign was General Masaharu Homma, commander of the Japanese 14th Army, which had led the invasion of the Philippines in 1941–42. Homma was charged with failing to control his troops and permitting the murder and abuse of prisoners during the march and in the camps that followed. The prosecution argued that, as the commanding general, Homma bore responsibility under international law for the actions of forces under his command, regardless of whether he personally ordered the atrocities. Homma's trial was conducted by a U.S. military commission in Manila, beginning on January 3, 1946. The proceedings included testimony from American and Filipino survivors who provided first-hand accounts of the conditions during the march. Witnesses described beatings, shootings, bayonettings, and deliberate starvation. Medical officers testified about the lack of water and the summary executions of men who fell behind. Documentary evidence, including Japanese reports and captured correspondence, established that Homma's headquarters had been informed of prisoner mistreatment but took no effective action to prevent or correct it. The defense argued that Homma had been unaware of the full extent of the abuses, claiming that the conduct of lower-ranking officers and non-commissioned personnel could not be fully monitored during a chaotic military operation. They also asserted that logistical challenges and the rapid advance of Japanese forces had made prisoner management difficult. The commission rejected these arguments. On February 11, 1946, Homma was found guilty of war crimes related to the Death March and subsequent treatment of prisoners. He was executed by firing squad at Los Baños, Luzon, on April 3, 1946. Other Japanese officers and enlisted men were also tried for their roles. In total, approximately 300 Japanese personnel were charged with crimes connected to the Bataan Death March and the operation of prison camps in the Philippines. Many of these trials took place under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Military Commission in Manila, while others were conducted by Philippine courts and allied tribunals in Tokyo. Punishments ranged from imprisonment to execution, depending on the level of responsibility and evidence presented. Among those convicted was Colonel Motu Nakayama, a senior staff officer who had overseen logistics for the movement of prisoners. He received a death sentence for neglecting to provide adequate food, water, and transport. Several lower-ranking officers and guards were sentenced to long prison terms for acts of violence, including bayoneting prisoners who collapsed during the march. The Japanese military police, Camp O'Donnell, personnel involved in the administration of Camp O'Donnell were also prosecuted for systematic brutality and neglect. The war crimes trials not only established individual accountability, but also set precedents for command responsibility, the legal doctrine that a commander is liable for crimes committed by subordinates if he knew or should have known about them and failed to act. The Homma case, in particular, became a key example referenced in later international legal proceedings. As the legal process unfolded, survivor testimonies played a central role in documenting the scale of suffering. Many former prisoners, including U.S. Army and Philippine Army personnel, provided sworn statements that were later compiled into official reports and historical archives. The U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's Office collected thousands of pages of deposition transcripts detailing the conditions of the march, the prison camps, and the medical consequences of malnutrition and disease. These testimonies were preserved as part of the records of the war crimes trials and later declassified for public access. Individual survivors also published personal accounts that contributed to the public understanding of the event. Memoirs such as They Call Us Dead Men, by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dooley, Ghost Soldiers by Hampton Sides, and earlier post-war writings by American officers provided detailed recollections of daily suffering and endurance. Filipino survivors likewise produced testimonies and local publications in the 1940s and 1950s, preserving their perspective on the shared ordeal. In the Philippines, the Bataan Death March became a powerful symbol of national suffering and resistance. Each year, April 9th, the date of the surrender of Bataan was designated as Araw ng Kagitingan, Day of Valor, a national day of remembrance honoring both Filipino and American soldiers who fought and died in the campaign. Memorials were erected along the route of the march, including stone markers in towns such as Mariveles, Orion, and San Fernando, tracing the 65-mile path of the prisoners. These sites serve as historical reminders of the human cost of the conflict. In the United States, remembrance took shape through veterans organizations and official commemorations. The American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC, established the Bataan Memorial at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and later dedicated additional monuments in New Mexico, where many members of the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery Regiments, both composed primarily of New Mexico National Guardsmen, had fought and been captured. Annual events such as the Bataan Memorial Death March, a 26-mile endurance march held at White Sands Missile Range, continue to honor the memory of the fallen and the survivors. Survivors' advocacy also contributed to public awareness and compensation efforts. In the decades following the war, American and Filipino veterans campaigned for recognition of their suffering and for government benefits. The U.S. Congress passed several resolutions acknowledging the heroism of the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. In the Philippines, veterans were recognized through awards and pensions. Though many struggled with long-term health issues resulting from captivity, the Bataan Death March also influenced broader post-war interpretations of Japan's wartime conduct. At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, in Tokyo, senior Japanese leaders such as General Hideki Tojo faced charges related to systemic war crimes across Asia. While the Tokyo trials did not focus exclusively on Bataan, the evidence of the march was introduced as part of the pattern of atrocities committed under Japanese occupation. The tribunal's verdicts reinforced the international principle that mistreatment of prisoners of war violated established laws of war, as outlined in the 1929 Geneva Convention. As decades passed, historical research on the Bataan Death March expanded through academic studies, military reports, and oral history projects. U.S. Army historians, including those of the Office of the Chief of Military History, published detailed analyses of the Philippine campaign. The U.S. Army Center of Military History later released official volumes documenting the Bataan operations, the surrender, and the treatment of prisoners. These works used wartime records, captured Japanese documents, and interviews with surviving personnel to build a factual chronology of events. In Japan, the subject of the Bataan Death March remained controversial. Some post-war Japanese publications attempted to downplay or rationalize the treatment of prisoners as a result of battlefield chaos. However, scholarly works by Japanese historians in later decades began to acknowledge the scale of the atrocity. Official Japanese statements expressed regret for the suffering inflicted, though full government apologies remained limited and carefully worded. By the late 20th century, the Bataan Death March had become a permanent fixture in both U.S. and Philippine military history education. It was studied in military academies as a case study in command responsibility, logistics, and humanitarian law. The narrative of endurance and suffering was also used to strengthen alliances between the two nations, emphasizing shared sacrifice. The physical legacy of the event is preserved in multiple memorials. The Mount Summit National Shrine in Bataan, completed in 1970, includes a towering cross that overlooks the former battlefields. The Bataan Death March Memorial in Capas, Tarlac, stands near the site of Camp O'Donnell, where tens of thousands perished after the march. These monuments include the names of the fallen, and are visited annually by veterans groups, students, and military delegations. Survivor numbers declined sharply in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. By the 2000s, only a handful of March survivors remained alive to recount their experiences firsthand. Oral history archives and video testimonies, preserved by institutions such as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, ensured that their accounts would remain accessible to future generations. In both nations, the Bataan Death March stands as a measure of wartime brutality and endurance. It represents not only the suffering inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army, but also the resilience of those who endured it. The legal accountability established in the immediate post-war years, the survivor testimonies, and the memorials constructed over time together form the lasting legacy of Bataan. Through judicial records, historical documentation, and annual commemoration, the memory of the march remains firmly rooted in the historical narrative of World War II. It continues to serve as evidence of the consequences of military excess and the violation of international law, ensuring that the suffering of those who walk the roads of Bataan is neither forgotten nor dismissed.